Hi, I'm Emma Smith, Artistic Director and CEO of Liverpool Irish Festival, and delighted to be here speaking as part of Irish Roots and having conversation with Karen and Laura, all of us live from Liverpool. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Laura to say a bit about herself, her mixed heritage and what it means.
My name's Laura. I live in Liverpool and I work in Liverpool as well. I sort of specialise in the arts and cities in Liverpool, and that's kind of my work, and it covers everything from writing to PR and marketing to producing. My heritage is I am Irish and I am Arab. My dad was born in Jerusalem. My mum was born in Mullingar, which is weirdly like more of a common like blend, I think, that people realize. So it meant that I kind of grew up in this with a Catholic background, but also with a sense of neither side of my family having come from here, which was quite a good thing in Liverpool. My mum always says her best friend would say to her whenever my mum said, "Oh, I just love England," and her friend would say, "You don't know England, you know Liverpool." And I think that's always a thing that's sort of driven my attitude towards the city, because I think not being from, not having a culture that comes from this country, there's a lot of blind spots and a lot of things you don't know, but you never know what you don't know, if that makes sense. And I think in Liverpool, there is a sort of shared understanding that you might not be part of the bigger whole, which makes it a lot easier when you're trying to figure that out for yourself.
And Karen, how about you? Would you explain a bit about your connection?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Karen Gallagher, and for many years I was running a dance organisation in the city, but recently became a freelancer, setting up my own projects. So I'm now producing and creating and coaching, so lots of different things. And interestingly, from Laura, I'm born and bred in Liverpool, and I was born into a white family because my dad had died really early on. So I didn't get to know that side of my family, which is the black side of my family. So I was brought up with a group of women who predominantly came from Ireland originally. My granddad met my nan. So I was in this kind of white community for a very long time in the city, and then realised that I was obviously different. I was kind of the only black child in the community, and began to know my father's side of my heritage, which is African. So my dad was born in Liverpool. His mum, my grandma, who only passed away 2 years ago at 104, was always described herself as a black Scouser more than anything. But her husband was from Warri in Nigeria. So it's a real kind of complex heritage in a way. I always knew I was different in the city because of the colour of my skin. So of course I started to really look at that culture, because that was my blackness. And I didn't really consider fully my Irishness, always very much considered myself as this Liverpool Scouser predominantly. So I'm really interested to start to really re-engage that side, I think, since talking with yourself, Emma, last year. And I kind of said, oh my God, I haven't really fully considered my Irishness. I've just taken it for granted, that Catholic side of me and where that came from. So I'm really interested to explore that a lot more, because I think I was predominantly so in search of my black identity that I kind of negated the Irishness and the white side of my heritage. My family are predominantly white in terms of where I've been brought up, but I've then also very much got this richness of this kind of African heritage that I kind of engage with, both kind of personally and professionally.
Thanks for that. So, I mean, I'm the odd one out in this group because I'm not Irish and really I'm not Scouse, although I've lived now in the Northwest for longer than I was ever from home, which has been wonderful for me. In what you're saying, there's a little bit about sort of exceptionalism in being Scouse rather than English to a point, and I wonder if that's a little bit to do with Irishness. But I also wonder whether or not the other side of your heritage is a barrier to accessing your Irishness. Laura, Karen, to you first.
I think not necessarily. I just think that I made choices, and I don't think that as a family, although there was always this kind of conversation about, well, your granddad was from Ireland, and because he died many years before I was born, I was predominantly with this just group of women. So my identity was very much about being driven by being a woman in this family. It was, my mum, my nan, my two aunties, we were all in this house together. And we never really talked about identity or where we were coming from. I think it was just a given, I guess, in terms of how I was brought up, going to church, being Catholic, being driven by some of those values and beliefs, as opposed to a kind of a cultural belief. And it wasn't until I began to engage with my African side that I began to really consider cultural identity and what that meant to me. And I guess that also was because of there were particular barriers to being who I was in the community. I did have racism, growing up, constantly called the N-word, called Zulu, from a very early age from school, because I was the only black kid in the school, but I didn't know that I was at the time, because I was in this all-white family, and they'd never, ever discussed, that side of my heritage. It was just that I was Karen, and I was their daughter or granddaughter or niece. It was never an issue. And in some ways, they kind of really strove to make me better. So I was always, sort of the top of the class. I was always neat and tidy and clean. That was the big thing for my mum, everything ironed, everything particular, had to stand out. And it wasn't until I then began to meet my grandmother that I realised that there was a whole other side to me, personally, that I wanted to explore. And that gave me a kind of credence, a kind of permission to fully be me prior to what I'd been before that, if that makes sense. But being a Scouser was key.
Yeah, that makes total sense, Karen, because I think one of the challenges you have when you're mixed heritage, particularly when you're sort of, I suppose, first generation mixed heritage, is you don't have anyone to learn it from. So if your mum is Irish and your dad is Arabic, with all the things that come from being a Palestinian Arab as well, with French identity and all that kind of stuff thrown in, you don't have anyone saying to you, this is how you blend these two cultures together. You do it yourself. And when you are of a certain age, I think, we're all of a roughly a similar age. We grew up in that time where you were navigating that heritage, where you also had signs everywhere that said no blacks, no Irish. So you're always very conscious about which side of my culture can I talk about in this conversation? Which one is acceptable? How is this one going to be perceived? And how do you navigate that? And that's quite tiring and that's quite exhausting. And you also have one of the challenges I've always found in terms of exploring my Irishness in Liverpool is that your Irishness doesn't belong to you in Liverpool sometimes. Everyone has it as a shared thing, so much that if you're an Irish citizen, if you have an Irish culture or an Irish identity, you have to be part of the bigger whole of it. And that can be quite hard because that might not be how you want to engage with your Irishness. You might want to have it in a very different way. And I find the same a lot of the time with my Arab heritage, having a family that left Palestine because of the Nakba, that has all of that kind of side of it, that will never go back to that home country that doesn't exist in the same way. You also don't belong to that either, because Palestinian identity is part of such a bigger conversation in this country as well. So navigating that sense of ownership and where you feel you can sit within it is something you completely have to learn by yourself. And that can be, there's a lot of thresholds with that. There's a lot of confidence with that. And it sometimes means that you only get to a certain age where you feel like you're allowed to do it.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's that kind of concept of the permission. And I think also growing up, I don't know about you, Laura, but for me, growing up in school, there was a little bit about Irish history. Maybe there was certainly nothing about African history. So you didn't have any of that context to be living in or to explore. And I think sometimes as families, as I say, my grandma was 104. And if I tried to have a conversation about race, she just wasn't interested. She'd be like, no, don't want to talk about it, not interested, because she'd had such bad experiences herself growing up. And so for her, that's what I said, she'd describe herself as a black Scouser. She was 100% Scouser, born and bred in the city. So I guess for me, that's what I kind of grasp onto. It's that idea. That's what I know. I very much know that I'm very much know I'm a Scouser. I know I'm a Liverpudlian. I know by the way I speak, the way I act, the things that I've done, how I've grown up. So that's kind of embedded in me far more. I feel like the other aspects of my culture are add-ons that I've not fully been able to consider or describe effectively. And I've been to places. I went to Uganda once, and they said, "Now here's, Karen. She's coming from the UK. She's a European." And I was kind of going, "Well, no, I'm African." No, you're not. You're European. And for the first time, I was really shocked that I was suddenly in Africa, feeling that I was coming home, in a sense, to a sector of what I consider home. And I was suddenly an outsider still, even in Africa. So it's kind of trying to kind of consider those different issues. And again, I'd not thought about before. I just assumed, they would see I'm black, so and I'm in Africa, and I'm African heritage. It would all make sense. But suddenly I was another again.
It's so interesting that, because I had the exact opposite thing the first time I went to Morocco, where I'd kind of had in this country, people would go, yeah, but where are you from though? Because like Arab looks are something that people don't, they assume Arab looks a particular way, and it's so, as with everything, it's so much more complex with that. Whereas the first time I went to Morocco, because my family is like French Arabic, I walked into there and this guy in the middle of a souk went, "Where are you from?" And he just looked at me and went, "You're obviously French Arabic," and then just started talking to me in French, just like straight away. And thankfully I knew what he was saying and could talk to him. And it was that sense of, oh no, you're part of us. This is your gang over here. Come and join us for lunch. And that was really interesting for me, because I'd never had that sense of people going, "Oh no, come over here. This is where you live. You're over in this space." And I found that really fascinating, because it was just that it kind of brought home to me, as you say there, that sense of Scouseness is the thing you can choose. You can choose to be a Scouser, and you can bring that, because we're so happy with the melting pot. We're so happy with the blend, and you feel really comfortable in that kind of Scouse identity. It is really comforting. But the rest of it, you feel like you have to navigate in a much more complicated way. So when someone kind of says to you, "Oh mate, it's over this way," you go, "Oh, sound, nice one. I'll do that. I'll head over to that place."
It sounds like there's an awful lot of emotional labour that comes through having dual identity and not having a kind of a guidance around that. And when you were both talking about that, I was thinking about how when I was at school, we were sort of taught this idea of not being able to see colour. But actually that barrier of not being allowed to see colour, not ask those questions about identity, sort of got in the way then of us understanding our own identity, of asking people to think about their own. I wonder what you think about that, and how you think that has changed, if you do. Laura, I'll come to you first.
I think the thing that has been the biggest change for me in the past sort of 10 years is choosing my own culture and my own journey with it, of learning it. Because 10 years ago, I lost my beloved French Arabic grandmother, who had been the sort of root of those stories for me. And then 5 years later, I lost my dad. So that sort of decade for me has very much been about, how do I navigate this by myself? And at the start, it was bringing a lot of stuff back from school of, I was called a terrorist from both sides and that kind of thing, which was really frustrating and complicating and made you feel really ashamed of it. Having people in your family go, "Don't talk about that. Just don't talk about that side." But what I've kind of done is sort of say, it's kind of no one else's business. It's sort of nothing to do with anybody else. It's to do with me and how I identify with, and how I sort of bring my stories up with it, and spending more time with people from like what they call the Palestine diaspora, because Palestine's diaspora is huge, because everyone left, everyone fled. There's an amazing story in Palestine 100, a book by Comma Press, where this woman who's sort of she's half Palestinian and lives in London, and she talks about her granddad who had his home in Jaffa, and he always kept the key to the house in his pocket, because he always thought one day he'd go back. And so much of it is rooted around this trauma that I was like, I cannot do that and deal with other people's reactions to it and other people's understandings and other people's mediations. And I can't do it. I can't do both. It doesn't belong to you in the same way it belongs to me. And I can't get into that fight sometimes. Sometimes I'm more than happy to get into the fight, but sometimes I'm really not. And I think giving yourself the permission sometimes to go, no, I'm not talking to you about that. That's nothing to do with you, is a really important part of it. But there's a massive privilege that comes with that, because being able to choose when you talk about that and when you don't is a massive privilege. So yeah, I think that's how I mean, I don't know if it's the same for you, Karen, or different.
I think sometimes that, but I think also for me, it's always been about trying to make visible. And I guess my culture, I think my heritage really has come through the professional decisions that I've made in terms of my career. So, dance has been really prolific in enabling me to be seen and to actually then possibly, now I'm considering it, maybe unconsciously driving those ideas forward. I've always, interestingly, now that I'm thinking about it, a lot of the work that I was always programming was from the African dance diaspora, and also from the Irish diaspora. So always very much about women. So I'm just wondering whether that's also about that kind of nurture, because of where I was coming from. It's very much female led. But in some ways, I think there's a frustration, because we can have that privilege, Laura, as you say, to kind of make that decision that we don't want to talk about it. But I also get frustrated that in doing that, maybe we create a barrier for others not to be able to join in the conversation. And I had this, since the whole thing with George Floyd and what's been going on with Black Lives Matter, I've been totally frustrated by friends of mine, colleagues of mine, who are white, European, middle class, who are suddenly running these organizations, and they're saying, we realize this is an uncomfortable conversation to be having. And I've been so frustrated by this. It's like, why should this suddenly be uncomfortable for you to kind of open your doors, openly express that maybe, with a bias that you've not been aware of? There's been an element of racism somewhere in your organization, and you're trying to rectify that. And that's okay by me. Feel okay to talk about it. Don't put up words like, this is difficult, this is uncomfortable, because as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing difficult or uncomfortable to be talking about race, culture, heritage, and how that kind of permeates through an organization, through an individual, or whatever. So it's trying to find, I've always felt that I want to be open to it all, so that people feel that they can have that conversation with me and not worry about maybe privilege or about political correctness, but just be able to actually have that conversation, Emma, so that actually, yes, you do see colour. I want you to see colour. I want you to see race. I want you to be able to have a conversation, as we are today, about, dual heritage, mixed heritage, or whatever, because unless we have those conversations and make ourselves visible, it will constantly be perceived as uncomfortable or difficult. So in some ways, I can't totally respect Laura in saying that actually, yeah, it is my choice. And yeah, it is. It absolutely is your choice. But then sometimes I also want to be able to be open so that people can have the conversation and not feel that they're making me uncomfortable or I'm making them uncomfortable in having that conversation. Because unless we explore and open up the conversation about our culture, then we're going to keep stopping and starting, and we'll go back again. We've had the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, it's all on a hiatus, and then it'll all just, disappear again, and we have to start again. And ideally, we shouldn't be starting again. We should be able to open this conversation up.
I think you're absolutely right, and I'm so pleased that they're the two sides of that argument, because they're both really positive about exploring heritage. And the whole point about that is, for people who haven't done it, they can learn an awful lot, not just about themselves, but the people they share a society with. And this idea that you can you can have one single heritage. I mean, in a modern world is ludicrous anyway, surely. But actually this idea that by being two heritages, you're not quite half of either, I really want to eradicate. I really want people to be able to celebrate that they are more than, that they are plus in terms of, sort of the heritage stakes. I think it's wonderful. And like you say, I think in us unpicking these things, actually we can stop having difficult conversations and start having really interesting conversations about what our connections are, what they mean to us, how that creates our society and lets us be more tolerant, more celebratory, more interested in one another. So on that sort of line, I wonder if I can just get both of you to talk a bit about your Irish connection. And Karen, I'm going to come to you first this time.
Okay, so I guess you can see by the Gallagher that, you know, that's where my Irishness comes from. And actually that is, you know, my mother's name, because my mother wasn't married when she had me. So I have my grandfather's name of Gallagher, and he was obviously from Donegal. Came, I think his family, I think he was a fisherman. So I think he definitely came on the boat, so to speak, you know, a long time ago now, so well over 100 years ago, settled in the north of Liverpool, so Scotty Road, met me nan, you know, and she was obviously from Liverpool, but she's an Eston, so I think she's probably got Welsh connections there. And then they settled in the north of Liverpool, so I was brought up in the north of Liverpool as a Catholic. Unfortunately, you know, had, you know, when we had the sort of troubles and the kind of, you know, the Orangemen, and, you know, it was a really, you know, I'm ashamed to say, you know, a really difficult time, because you were brought up to kind of hate Protestant people. And then obviously the big thing for us, you know, growing up was the Irish parade, you know, King Billy parade, but it came with a lot of aggression, a lot of aggravation. And in some ways, the conversations that we're having about inclusivity, that wasn't there, you know, in the 60s, for me growing up in the 60s and 70s. And so I think my Irishness came from that kind of situation, I guess, me understanding that I had an Irishness, that I didn't want to accept one part of it. And also, I think, as I said, I think a lot of my Irishness came through my religion of being a Catholic. It's very much, you know, you were always there with the Irish priest, you know, the Irish nuns. You know, that they kind of informed my early kind of days of growing up. And went to an all-Catholic school, so an all-Catholic girls' school. So I kind of was informed by a lot of that. And also, we had the Irish Centre at the bottom of where we lived. So every week, we would go along to the Irish Centre and watch the Irish dancing. But I never considered I was Irish enough to have joined in. You know, I don't think my mum would never have said to me, "Oh, go and learn some Irish dancing," as a child. So I was always, again, I was always a bit of an outsider. I think because my mum maybe didn't fully embrace her Irishness either. So I guess that's where I come from, you know, those early days. But then at 16, wanting to then connect with my African side. So it's only now, I think, that I'm fully embracing that aspect of my identity. Even though as I said, I've probably unconsciously been doing that for a long time. It's only now that I'm starting to go, actually, let's really consider this now. Let's consider, you know, where you come from, and let's celebrate, as you say, and actually have that tolerance across the board.
And Laurie, your connections with Ireland?
So my mum was born in Mullingar. She moved to England in the early 60s, mid 60s. She came to Liverpool to do teaching, basically. So she was at Notre Dame, and she worked at she worked at various Catholic schools in the city. So she'd worked in Huyton, she worked in West Derby first as well, at St Paul's. She worked at St Vin's in town, at All Saints in Anfield. She's like this superstar top infant teacher before she retired. And both her parents had died before I was born. So we didn't have, I mean, on neither side, really, we didn't have like the home that was in the place where you're from type of thing, because, my dad's family had moved over to England in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s. And, mum had sort of, when she left Ireland, moved to England, her parents died within a few years. So it was kind of strange of the understanding how much of it was the Irishness has always been really fascinating. And the religion, defo side of it. I mean, I went to like 2 convent schools, and the Catholicism was a massive part of it. And then the learning of the phrases of like learning Irish phrases when you were a child and then realizing it as an adult, the things you were learning was always quite fascinating. And, being able to pronounce and also spell names at 7 and 8 that your friends would be like, but that's just a load of consonants, was always a thing. And there was always a sense of my mum's, I think the same as you, Karen, my mum's relationship with her Irishness is really complicated. And she'd always wanted to get away from Ireland, but instilled massive amounts of Irish values into us. Like the way my brother and I always saw education was rooted in our Irish identity, because education is so different in Ireland. And that determination to get an excellent education is part and parcel of Irish culture. And the love of reading and the written word was a huge part of it. And it was only, I think it's only as I became an adult of sort of seeing the differences between England and Ireland that I realised how Irish my mum was. And there was also a slightly weird side of it. So when my mum got ill when I was a teenager, she had a tracheostomy put in. And she had to relearn how to speak and all that kind of thing. She's grand, but she had to relearn how to speak. And when I saw a video of her when I was in my late teens before she had the tracheostomy, and I'd never realised how strong her Irish accent was. And that was a massive shock to me of just how really, really strong my mother's Irish accent had been. Because for me, I'd sort of forgotten what her voice sounded like before the tracheostomy. So there was this real strange reminder of my mother as this bolshy, loud, difficult, truculent Irish woman with a very, very strong Irish accent, whipping 7-year-olds in Liverpool into shape, with their maths and English. So that was always that's always been quite a surprise to me, I think, of that. My relationship with my mum's Irishness is as much part of my Irishness as hers in some ways.
And it's interesting, Laura, because you've got that first-hand kind of, sort of first generation connection with Ireland, whereas I don't have that. So, for me, the family that were born, my mum and aunties and uncles, yes, they had this Irish dad, but he died, in his 50s. So them growing up never really related to really fully being Irish, even though we know that we have those ties and links to Ireland. It's never been something that's been pushed upon us fully. But as you say, we still went through those roots of the Catholicism and kind of what that brought in terms of introducing me to Irish people, I suppose.
So I realise that we're sort of coming around to some timing issues here, but have you got a moment to stay on, Laura?
Yes. Yeah, I've got 5 minutes.
I wonder what Ireland and Irishness is going to mean to you in the coming decade. So as we sort of crest Brexit and all of those other sorts of things, I wonder how maybe you'll engage in your Irishness, or whether or not it is just so innate, it's part of you and you're part of it, and that's it.
I think the biggest change is that I actually physically I got an Irish passport because of Brexit. I'd always known I was entitled to it. I was always known I had a right to get it. And the first thing I did after the 23rd of June, my birthday, by the way, thanks for that. The first thing I did was get all the paperwork together and apply for an Irish passport. And me and my brother did that at the same time. And that wasn't a work thing. That wasn't so I could continue to work in the EU. That was, no, my mixed heritage now becomes part of who I am and how you see me. And that made my Irishness more important. And I think that's one of the things that I think Brexit has done an awful lot in making people define what their status and what their identity is in a way that I don't think a lot of supporters of Brexit ever fully realise. I am much less aligned to my Britishness now than I was before. And it has made me actively say, okay, why do I choose that Irishness, that Irish identity, that Irish citizenship? Why is that the thing that I want? I'd studied Irish history and I'd learned all about that. And, you know, my mother is incredibly political and would teach me about a lot of different things. But reading all the different bits and really delving into it in a way to kind of say, what is my Irishness and what does it mean and where does it come from, is something I'm always going to continue to do. Because I think when you do have that heritage and that culture, you do have a responsibility to learn about it and get more into it and do it with open eyes and an open mind and backed up by knowledge and understanding. So there's a greater desire to do that now, in a way that I think I thought before Brexit, I thought I always had time to do it, and Brexit just put a timeline on it and put a deadline on it that I had to do it. So that's kind of, I think, the plan for me, to just learn as much about it as I can, outside of just knowing about James Joyce. You know what I mean?
Karen, how about
I love
you?
James Joyce, don't get me wrong, but he's not the only one in town. So
there's all sorts of seats at the table.
Yeah, I think because I suppose in a way a lot of my Irishness is removed in a sense, and I'm only beginning to fully appreciate my Irishness and that connection, that I'm at a really early doors connectivity. You know, unlike Laura, I'm not even sure that I can get an Irish accent. It wasn't something that I considered. I'm devastated that I now have this horrible blue-black passport, because I had to get a new passport recently. So I'm no longer European, which breaks my heart. But so I guess for me, it's just about, as I said earlier, I think the idea of making visible, talking more about it, embracing it for myself, and I guess trying to see where that takes me. Interestingly, today before this chat, I was like, do you know, I really need to start doing my family tree. It's not, my cousins have done it on my nan's side, and we've kind of got this, you know, on my black side, on my African side, and we're actually on my African side related to who is it now? Oh, I've forgotten. Anyway, and a Scottish Robert the First, Robert the Bruce. So we're actually related to Robert the Bruce on that side. So I'm thinking I need to do the other side. I need to do my maternal side. Obviously, that's my paternal side. So I'm really interested now to maybe start making that little voyage to kind of go, oh, let's kind of check out this, where we can go.
It's so amazing.
So I've got two quick things to say on that. One is we might be able to help you with that with a partner organisation of ours called Island XO, who might be able to help you find a little reference. So, after this, we'll set that up. The other thing, the last kind of question that I really just wanted to get in quickly was, how do you feel your Irishness accepts your other heritage? Does it wrap around it? Do they talk to one another? Have you been able to reconcile those? Is it favourable? That's too many questions, I know, but I wonder how you're thinking ahead, how they'll work together now that you have begun to understand your changing relationship with Irishness.
Well, for me, I think they've just always been there. It's, you know, I think Laura mentioned it earlier on. It's like we just move forward with who we are. It's an acceptance of who I am. I'm not necessarily purporting to be kind of, you know, waving an Irish flag and a Nigerian flag and a British flag. But for me, it's more about being comfortable in my own skin and being able to identify with all of those aspects of who I am. You know, I broadly tend to describe myself as a black female Scouser. That tends to be what sums me up, and all the things that come with that relate to who I am moving forward. So I won't forget what they are, but I'm not particularly going to be ramming them down people's throats. I will just do as I've always done, make them visible by my own practice and by being open enough to have the opportunities to chat about them or to create things that actually describe them and maybe begin to develop a conversation around them. Because cultural identity predominantly is probably the key driver for me in a lot of the decisions that I make, whether they be professional or personal.
Laura?
It's really funny because there's actually an Irish Palestinian agency in Dublin that I DM on Twitter because I work in both Arab arts and Irish arts. So I found that quite entertaining. And there's also a really fabulous arts festival in Dublin that celebrates Arab arts. So the Irish and Arab identity is actually something that's out there and is quite visible, which I really, really love. And I really love the weirdness of it. It feels weird to me because it's so familiar, if that makes sense. I think it's about I think that sense of visibility is right, and kind of having the confidence to say it's something new, and it's, as we say, it's like it's a path you're going to forge forward. I kind of think Ireland's in a really interesting place right now because Ireland is changing a lot, and Irish is, geographically in this place of like with Brexit and the EU shifting, where Ireland does become a bit more of a beacon in many ways than it has been before. And I think Irish and mixed heritageness is going to become more important to Ireland if it's going to forge that path. So I think we're sort of on the front line of it a bit. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that is handled, and also how it ties your identity in with it. I think Ireland's diaspora has kind of spread out into the corners of the world and is now thinking about heading home a bit. And for Ireland, how they accept that, I think, is going to define Irishness for a lot of people for the next generation. And that's going to be a really interesting thing because we're going to play a part in that. And my mum always says, you don't know Ireland, you know Dublin. And that's a really interesting thing because, Ireland isn't just its cities and major conurbations. It's, it's the countryside and the bits in between that's really interesting as well. But I think the role we play in Irishness is going to be, whether it's welcome, is going to be an interesting side to it, I think, moving forward.
I completely agree, and I think an awful lot of what was sort of said there is very much the Irish Festival's approach, that being able to be one step removed and taking a look in it and thinking about things like Ireland's progression with the diaspora policy, but what that means to us here and diaspora around the world, I think is really fascinating. There is a moment here where Ireland is looking to be incredibly progressive and that we can learn ever such a lot from it. And so these discussions around mixed heritages and recognising that nothing is what it seems. Everything is more complicated underneath, and it's beautiful for that, but we can celebrate it, we can raise it, elevate it, try to understand it, feels incredibly important and also remarkably contemporary. So to come back to what you were saying, Karen, about Black Lives Matter, for instance, of course it's important we talk about it. Of course it's important that we raise all of those issues around who we are, because it's got to make white people look at themselves as well. Like, we need to understand who we are. And like Laura was saying about Brexit, that's making the British think about who they are. And very specifically, I think, the English, because actually we haven't got that Scots history, that Welsh history, that Irish history. We haven't considered ourselves as something separate. It's our privilege to call ourselves British.
I think that's quite interesting, though, because, being English is not just being English, so as in being a Scouser is not just being a Scouser. I think there are those key links. I think if we look at, just by our surnames, in terms of where we actually come from, my partner was Jones, they were definitely from Wales, I'm from Ireland, you can see from our surname alone, so I think it's about getting that understanding, as you say, as English people, are we ever really English? And kind of having a sense of those conversations as well. And hopefully that idea of Irishness should come through I would hope, in those conversations, and open it up right across the board. Right across the board. I think, you know, with Black Lives Matter, there's been that whole thing, isn't there, where a lot of white people have been going, well, all lives matter, all lives, and absolutely that's the point, is yes, all lives matter when all lives matter. And if Black lives aren't mattering, or Irish lives aren't mattering, or whatever, then we're not going to get that equitable understanding about who we are and where we fit within the world. So I guess it is having this kind of opening up that whole conversation. And that it's interesting because, you know, in Ireland, you know, there are a lot of Black people in Ireland, but interestingly, until they open their mouths with an Irish accent, people don't accept them as being Irish, you know, so it's that kind of...
I completely agreed. And until Black Lives Matter, nobody's life matters nearly enough. So I think we've got to make that call more and more, and be more strident, more anti-racist about that. Absolutely. Because that allows gateways for other people who don't have, for want of better terminology, that kind of Black visibility to also speak about their identities. So I'm thinking at the moment particularly about our Chinese Irish community in Liverpool, where the Chinese community have been so horribly hit by oppressive acts due to COVID, not due to COVID, that's bad terminology on my part.
I know what you mean, yeah.
Bad interpretation of the fact that COVID came from China means that Chinese people who have lived in Britain for generations are being blamed for a completely new thing, and awful targeting has happened. And actually that's pushing them back and away and into places of isolation that are just abhorrent today. So our way of trying to get into this through the Irish Festival is to ask people to think about their Irishness, and in thinking about that, we start to unpick and unravel all sorts of other kind of heritage around that. So that's been really fascinating for us. And like you said earlier about your family and your personal experience, an awful lot of that has come through women. Yeah. So we have this strand of work called Invisible Women, which is actually to try and flip that, to create that female visibility and to overturn that idea of, if you call something matriarchal, it is. It's not. These women have been the maintainers of these histories, but actually haven't really been heard and haven't had any of the sort of limelight that their male counterparts have. So we're really sort of driving those agendas because we think it helps everybody. So as you say, Black Lives Matter is really important because ultimately it makes us a better society, in the same way that having women in leadership roles and Black people in leadership roles helps society. So we're really thankful that you and Laura and many of the people that joined us in the Mixed Race Mixer last year, and in the films that we've created around your heritage lives, have joined with us and trusted us with those identities, because I think they're personal, aren't they? Like Laura said, you know, these are personal to you, and although there might be a collective sharing and even maybe a collective trauma from leaving and migrating, actually those stories are all very independent and unique. But collectively, those strings make a really strong rope. And that's kind of where we're hoping to build those tolerances and show that the differences are spectacular, but they also can bring us together.
Absolutely, I think. And also it is, you know, in some ways, you know, as Laura was saying as well, it's our responsibility to stand up and be at some point, whether it's a gateway to people kind of crossing those barriers of, you know, of concern that they may have about how they approach or talk to each other. And I think, as you say, if the Irish Festival, Liverpool Irish Festival, is beginning to kind of galvanise and, you know, bring together those stories to then be told, I think that's really important moving forward. So well done to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope lots more people will get involved and join us on that journey. And those journeys will be, I hope, in time, fully intersectional and really fun and engaging. I think there's two little things that have kind of come out of this, which include the fact that what anybody else thinks of you is none of your business. If you can kind of put that one to bed, you can get rid of an awful lot in terms of emotional labour. But actually, you raised a really important point and encountered that. It's that we need to create safe space for people to talk and to ask questions, not because it's difficult, but because by unpacking it, we can actually help find answers and solutions to things and break down intolerances through understanding and connection, and the fact that we're really not that different, but that we can really celebrate those facets of our history, our personality, our collective character, all of those things. You know, Liverpool wouldn't be what it is today without that Irish influence and impact, I don't think, and that we all benefit from that is worth acknowledging.
Yeah, I think absolutely. But what you're saying as well is it's all of those things. It's, you know, in terms of Liverpool, it is the Irishness, it is the Africanness, it is the Chineseness. You know, there's been a real embrace of, well, actually, there hasn't been a full embrace of culture, but all of those cultures exist and have coexisted for a long time. So it's about, you know, historically kind of unpicking all of that and bringing it to the fore so that people actually appreciate that this is not a new thing, you know. But the barriers that have controlled us are those that are now suddenly beginning to be broken down. And if we can kind of break them down, open them, whatever we need to do to kind of have that kind of cross conversation, that connectivity that you're talking about, then hopefully we can broaden the conversation.
But isn't it incredible? I still find it incredible that people assume that Irishness is white, or that or white is assumed to be Irish or British necessarily. It isn't. I think, you know, to unpick all of that is going to take us some time, but that's where the assumptions need challenging most, actually. That, you know, a black person's Irishness could be hidden behind blackness, but also, you know, so much is going on in there where things are hidden from one another. Like there's a priority listing of what is visible and what isn't. Yeah,
I mean, I think a couple of years back, I was in Australia for a conference, and the whole thing was about, you know, considering cultural identity. And one of the things we were all asked to do, which tends to happen more in Australia than it does here, is about describe yourself from your cultural heritage. And I think we don't tend to do that here in the UK. So if you were actually describing or knowing, I think we don't know fully our cultural heritage sometimes. So for those folk, they were like, come from here, 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 here. I'm from this tribe, da-da-da. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, I don't know where I come from. Where do I come from? And I was having to really gather all of that information. But interestingly, again, because I knew from my paternal side that I actually yes, come from Africa, but also now come from Scotland, from Robert the Bruce. And then I know that I come from Ireland. I know that my grandfather's from Nigeria, but I don't necessarily always bring them together as a descriptor of who I am.
And do you think, I'm thinking particularly about a conversation I had a couple of years ago around this. Do you think that there are any issues in that? So does that question ever come from a loaded position? So, for instance, you're like, oh, whereabouts in Ireland are you from? And that brings with it a set of characteristics that you're assumed to have. Is that a potentially dangerous sort of qualifying question?
I think only dangerous when you don't know the answer. So someone says, and where exactly in Ireland are you from? And you go, I don't know. Like for a long, long time, I didn't know I was from Warri in Nigeria. I didn't know. I knew I was African. Didn't know what part of Africa I came from till I really started to examine that, you know. And then it was like, no, you're Nigerian. No, you're from the Warri tribe. And I remember ages ago going, I was at a spa, and this guy, you know, there was a couple they'd come up from down south to this spa, and they started asking me where I was from. I said Warri, Nigeria, and then they started going into all the different aspects of the different types of people in Warri. And again, I was like, don't know that. So again, it's about, we have all of these things that describe us. We know that we're from certain places, but we don't always fully know. I think Laura is in a fantastic position. You know, how she describes where she's coming from, very clearly knows those places she's come from, where her parents have come from. She's been given a lot of information. She's also studied a lot. And I think sometimes we don't always have those opportunities, you know, to study or research or be informed by family or, you know, sort of education. So there's so much to do, and there's only so much you can do. And I think we can't get bogged down by that. And again, that honesty that I talked about earlier is right across the board. So it's okay to also say you don't really know where you come from. I think that's also okay. It's okay to acknowledge it, but to appreciate that actually you haven't got all the answers.
I mean, if we were all just a little bit less hypercritical and quick to judge, that would make things a lot easier, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think I'm going to wrap that up there and say thank you ever so much to Karen and to Laura, who very sadly had to duck away for another meeting before we were able to conclude this. But we're really, really very grateful to have you both on board. We're hoping to have lots of exciting programme like this and to work with Lorraine and I Am Irish Again as part of this year's Liverpool Irish Festival, which will take place from the 21st to the 31st of October 2021. Do have a look at our website, www.liverpoolirishfestival.com, for more information, and we'll look forward to seeing you as part of Irish Roots and as part of the festival later in the year. Thanks so much for your time.
Hi, my name is Joanne Webb, and I'm going to read you something that I wrote a few months ago called A Love Letter to Prejudice on the Emerald Isle. It was a snapshot in time, and I'd love to share it with you. To my aunt, who loved me with every fibre of her being and told me each time I came home from London how proud she was of me and my good new job, and to never come home with the darkie. To my friend's dad, who gave me a job within a week of returning to Ireland so I could get a visa quickly for my Kenyan partner, and who said a few months later, "I don't hire niggers," when I handed him the CV of a qualified man searching for work. This educated, brilliant man whom I adore. To my uncle, who said of my little 3-year-old, "Make sure he smiles when we take a picture or we won't see him. Ha ha ha." To my mother's best friend, lost for so many years, a warm embrace in the Isle of Liddle when we meet again, and then said, "Make sure you don't leave him at home with his dad. We often find they come to church and they've left their children at home. We tell them they can't, but they just don't listen." To my friend who took me aside to say, "I don't like the way your son is dancing. It's too sexy, and my son is copying it," when my son was about 8. He dances the way he danced in the village under the sun. That's just the way his body moves. I get it. I too used to watch small girls shake their bums and put a sexual narrative onto it, until I realized that's just the way they move. To my brother, who after a few glasses of wine asked, "Come here, but is it true what they say about black men's dicks?" To myself, who dreamt that my son was being bullied at school for the colour of his skin, who turned up to the house to confront the child's parents, who knocked on the door and said who I was. "Who? Noah's mum?" "Who's Noah?" "You know, Noah with the big afro." "You're Noah's mum?" "Yes." Mounting frustration. "Look, I don't know if you're aware of what your son has been saying to Noah, but let me just stop you there. You and I both know that my son is better than yours, okay? I mean, I get it. You've got a brown kid. You have to act like they're equal, but you and I both know that. Let's just leave it there." Angry rebuttal rising to my lips, rage, and then, yeah, you're right. Sorry to have bothered you. You know, I walk away. In the dream, I walk away and I wake up with my heart pounding. Am I too a racist? Am I? To us, Irish humans afraid. To the woman in the post office who just wants someone to understand her and who gets confused with all the new accents and people she doesn't recognize. To the man who barks at a child at an ATM because he's seen one too many cop shows where the black man is the crim, and so automatically he thinks this child is going to rob him. To you who's only known white skin and Catholic repression and potatoes and pasta, who is fascinated and afraid of what you're drawn to like a magnet in repulsion and attraction and confusion. I see you. To you who doesn't know if you can say black or brown and who's afraid of messing up, so you never move forward. You never reach out, though you really want to. And you try sometimes with a shy smile or a hello that's never seen. To you that is afraid of the shaking bums and the loud foreign tongues and the different gods and the familiarity and closeness of another human body that doesn't look like yours. I feel you. To you that is so genuinely scared that our culture and our homes and our women will be taken. To you, I try to see you. I try to see me, to step back into that dream, to remember that you too carry colonization in your bones. You too carry a stolen land and dignity and language and manhood cut in your blood and on your soul. That maybe deep down you really do love and you really do want to protect. I want to make space for you too in this love letter to us. All of us. And ultimately to you. You who came out of my body. You who does a traveller character in the middle of Duns with your huge big hair and won't shut up when I tell you it's racist. Who runs down the prom with your friend being Indians asking if someone wants to eat in a booze fish shop. The head shake is too much. You who asked me, would you say that if I was white? When I ask you to lower your hoodie. Who came home from school saying, Mom, everyone says Trump hates us and is going to kill all brown people. Your little face ashen with shock. And who just today said, Dad told me sometimes we have to dress better to be taken seriously. You who I can't protect from all this mess. We in Ireland are masters of shame. It is inside us, seeped into the brown soil of this fertile green land. It is bestowed upon us in the holy waters of our baptism. It is at the edge of our secret lusty thoughts. It's in our bedrooms and our wardrobes and our Garda stations. As we attempt to slough it off, we use it as a weapon of left and right. You racist, you lefty loon, you N-lover, Irish hater, misogynist. I would never be like you. You are wrong. You are other. To all of you, to all of me, please, can we just start talking again and showing our beautiful, messy, prejudiced Irish hearts so we can have a real conversation for once.
Thank you for tuning in to Irish Roots. Irish Roots is a completely volunteer-led festival. If you can donate, please do. For more information and to see what else is happening, jump over to our website. It's www.iamirish.org. From all of us at I Am Irish, Gurav Mila Mahagut.